All right, buckle up. Because we're about to take a wild ride back in time. And I mean way back. We're talking roughly 4,500 years ago, to a land wedged between two mighty rivers, a place that would make even the most seasoned traveler stop dead in their tracks and just stare in absolute disbelief. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia. Welcome to the land the Greeks would later call the land between the rivers. Welcome to the cradle of civilization itself. And trust me, by the time we're done here today, you're gonna look at your smartphone, your GPS, your online banking app, and think to yourself, wait a minute, did those Sumerians already figure this stuff out thousands of years before us? Because honestly, kind of, yeah. Now, before we dive headfirst into all of this, let me ask you something real quick. Have you ever stopped to think about where all of it started? Not just writing, not just cities, not just government, but the whole package, the whole shebang. The idea that human beings could organize themselves, specialize their skills, trade across hundreds of miles, build structures that defied everything nature threw at them, and document it all so that future generations would know exactly what went down. That's wild, right? That genuinely gives you goosebumps when you really sit with it. Because we're not talking about some small, isolated tribe stumbling through the wilderness. We're talking about a full-blown, sophisticated, buzzing civilization that was operating at a level that would blow your mind. So here's the setup. Around 2500 BC, give or take a century or two. Because hey, we're working with ancient records here, not a Google Calendar. The region of Mesopotamia, which today roughly corresponds to modern Iraq and parts of Syria and Kuwait, was home to some of the most advanced city-states the ancient world had ever seen. Places like Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, and Eridu weren't just little villages. These were proper cities. We're talking tens of thousands of people living, working, arguing, trading, praying, and building together in an organized urban environment. And right at the heart of all of it, the Sumerians, the OGs of civilization, as some historians like to say. And honestly, that title is well earned. Now let's talk technology, because this is where things get really juicy. When most people hear the word technology, they picture silicon chips and touchscreens. But technology, at its core, is just the application of knowledge to solve problems. And the Sumerians? Oh, they were absolutely elite problem solvers. These folks were out here hacking the ancient world before hacking was even a concept. Let's start with the wheel. Yeah, everyone knows the Sumerians invented the wheel, right? Well, sort of. The truth is a little more nuanced, and if anything, even more impressive. The earliest wheels we know of weren't actually used for transportation first. They were used for pottery. The potter's wheel, a rotating platform that allowed craftspeople to shape clay with incredible precision and speed, appears in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia around 3500 BC. Now by 2500 BC, the technology had evolved dramatically. The wheel had migrated from the pottery workshop to the chariot, to the cart, to the wagon. The Sumerians were using wheeled vehicles to move goods across their cities and into the surrounding countryside. Think about what that means for a second. Before the wheel, you either carried something on your back, dragged it, or used animals directly. With the wheel, suddenly you could load up a cart with hundreds of pounds of grain, pottery, textiles, or metals, and move it with a fraction of the effort. Does that not blow your mind just a little bit? I mean, come on. That's not just clever, that's game-changing. And speaking of game-changing, let's talk about irrigation. Now this one might not sound as flashy as the wheel, but hear me out, because this is arguably the single most important technological achievement of the Sumerian civilization. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was incredibly fertile, but only if you could get water to your crops at the right time. The rivers flooded unpredictably, and the rains were not always reliable. So what did the Sumerians do? They engineered the landscape. They dug canals, miles and miles of canals, branching off from the main rivers like veins from an artery, channeling water deep into the agricultural hinterlands of each city-state. They built levees to control flooding. They constructed reservoirs to store water for the dry season. They developed sluice gates, early versions of floodgates, to manage the flow of water with real precision. And here's the kicker. This wasn't some casual, informal thing. Managing a canal network of that scale required coordination. It required administration. It required record-keeping, which means it was a direct driver of some of the other technologies and social innovations that the Sumerians are famous for. You see how it all connects? You pull on one thread, and suddenly you're unraveling the whole sweater. That's what makes studying ancient Mesopotamia so addictive, honestly. Now, can we talk about metallurgy for a second? Because this is one of those topics where the more you learn, the more your jaw just drops. By 2500 BC, the Sumerians were well into what we call the Early Bronze Age, a period defined by the widespread use of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, to make tools, weapons, agricultural implements, and decorative objects. And producing bronze was not a simple task. You need copper and tin, and neither of those metals is found naturally in the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. So where did they come from? Trade. But we'll get to that in a minute. The actual process of smelting and alloying metals required specialized knowledge, specialized furnaces, and skilled craftsmen who understood things like temperature control, the ratios of different metals, and the properties of different alloys. These were not amateurs. These were professionals, ancient metallurgists who had developed their craft over generations and were passing that knowledge down through apprenticeship systems. The bronze tools they produced were sharper, harder, and more durable than anything you could make from pure copper or stone. Plows tipped with bronze could cut deeper into the earth. Axes and chisels made from bronze could shape wood and stone with greater efficiency. And the economic ripple effects of better tools were enormous. More efficient farming meant more surplus food, which meant more people could specialize in non-agricultural work, which meant more craftsmen, more traders, more administrators, more priests, more of everything that makes a complex society tick. Now, here's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention when people talk about Sumerian technology. Their construction techniques. The cities of ancient Mesopotamia were built primarily from mud brick, because that's what the environment provided in abundance. Stone was rare and had to be imported. Timber was scarce. But mud? Mud you had plenty of. And the Sumerians figured out how to use it brilliantly. They developed standardized brick sizes. And yes, standardization is absolutely a technology. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. When your bricks are all the same size and shape, construction becomes faster, more efficient, and structurally sounder. They built massive temple complexes called ziggurats, enormous stepped pyramidal structures that dominated the skyline of each city and served as the religious, administrative, and economic centers of Sumerian life. The great ziggurat of dedicated to the moon god Nana, was a feat of architectural engineering that still inspires awe today. And can you imagine what it must have looked like to an ancient traveler approaching the city of for the first time? Seeing that massive structure rising up from the flat plain like something out of a dream. I mean, seriously, doesn't that just give you chills? And then there's writing. Oh boy, writing. This might be the Sumerians' single greatest contribution to human civilization, and the story of how it developed is so beautifully practical that it almost makes you laugh. Writing didn't start as poetry or literature or philosophical reflection. It started as accounting. True story. The earliest written records from Mesopotamia, clay tablets with marks pressed into them using a reed stylus, are essentially receipts and inventory lists. Things like 30 jars of barley received from the storehouse of the temple, or 5 units of silver paid to such and such craftsmen. This system, which we call cuneiform from the Latin word for wedge-shaped, because of the distinctive wedge-shaped marks made by the stylus, evolved over centuries from simple pictographs into a complex writing system capable of recording language, law, literature, and mathematics. By 2500 BC, Cuneiform was being used not just for economic records, but for legal contracts, royal proclamations, religious hymns, and administrative correspondence between city-states. The implications of this are almost impossible to overstate. Writing meant that information could be stored outside of human memory. It could be transmitted across distances and across time. A merchant in Ur could send a written contract to a trading partner in a distant city, and both parties would have a reliable record of their agreement. A king could issue laws and have them inscribed on stone stele for all to see. Knowledge could accumulate across generations in a way that was simply impossible in an oral-only culture. Writing, in short, was the original cloud storage, and the Sumerians were the ones who built it. Now, let's shift gears and talk about trade, because honestly, the Sumerian trade network is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated stories in all of ancient history. And to understand why trade was so central to Sumerian civilization, you first have to understand the fundamental geographic problem these people were dealing with. Mesopotamia, for all its agricultural richness, was resource-poor in almost every other way. No stone, no timber, no metal ores. The alluvial plain between the rivers was extraordinarily fertile, yes, but if you wanted to build a stone temple, make a bronze tool, or craft a wooden ship, you had to get those materials from somewhere else. And so the Sumerians became traders. Not out of choice, really, but out of necessity. And as it turns out, necessity is one heck of a motivator. By 2500 BC, Sumerian merchants, a class of professional traders known as the Tamkarum, were operating what amounted to a sophisticated long-distance trade network that stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south all the way to Anatolia in the north, and from the Indus Valley civilization in the east to Egypt and the Levant in the west. Let that sink in for a moment. We're talking about a trade network covering thousands of miles, operated by merchants who had no GPS, no compass, no satellite imagery, no international trade law, and no modern banking system. And yet they made it work. They made it work brilliantly. How's that for impressive? The goods flowing through this network were diverse and valuable. From the Persian Gulf and the mysterious land known as Dilmun, which many scholars believe corresponds to modern Bahrain, came copper, gold, and exotic goods. From the Indus Valley civilization, with whom the Sumerians apparently had direct trade contact, came carnelian beads, ivory, and other luxury items. From the mountains of what is now Iran and Afghanistan came lapis lazuli, that gorgeous deep blue semi-precious stone that the Sumerians absolutely loved and used extensively in their jewelry, royal regalia, and temple decorations. The famous Standard of Ur, one of the most remarkable artifacts ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, is inlaid with lapis lazuli that came from mines in modern-day Afghanistan, over 1,000 miles away. Does that not just knock your socks off? In exchange, Mesopotamia exported its agricultural surpluses, grain, dates, dried fish, as well as manufactured goods like textiles, pottery, and finished metal objects. The textile industry deserves special mention here, because it was one of the most economically significant industries in all of ancient Mesopotamia. Wool and linen fabrics produced in Mesopotamian workshops were traded across the ancient Near East and were often used as a form of currency in commercial transactions. The city of Ur alone had textile workshops employing hundreds of workers, and clay tablets record the quantities of wool processed, the number of workers employed, their rations, and the finished goods produced with an almost obsessive level of detail. These people were running what were, in effect, ancient factories, and they were keeping meticulous records of everything, which brings us to one of the most sophisticated aspects of Sumerian commercial culture, their financial and legal systems. Because you can have all the goods in the world, but if you don't have a reliable system for conducting transactions, setting prices, enforcing contracts, and resolving disputes, your trade network is going to fall apart pretty quickly. The Sumerians knew this, and they built institutional frameworks to support their commercial activities that were, frankly, remarkably sophisticated. The temple institutions of each city-state played a central role in the economy. Temples weren't just religious centers, they were economic powerhouses. They owned land, employed workers, stored surplus grain and other commodities, acted as lenders, and managed large-scale craft production. The concept of institutional credit, lending goods or silver with an expectation of repayment plus interest, was well established in Sumerian society by 2500 BC. Clay tablets record loan agreements with specified interest rates, collateral arrangements, and repayment schedules. Merchants conducting long-distance trade could receive goods on credit from temple institutions or wealthy private individuals, conduct their trading expeditions, and repay the principal plus interest upon their return. Now, does that sound familiar? Because it should. That's basically how modern trade finance works. Letters of credit, merchant loans, interest-bearing debt. Concepts we think of as modern financial innovations were being used by Sumerian merchants over 4,000 years ago. And if that doesn't make you sit back and go, "Wait, seriously?" then I don't know what will. The legal framework supporting all of this commercial activity was also surprisingly well developed. Contracts were recorded on clay tablets and witnessed by multiple parties. There were established procedures for resolving commercial disputes. Weights and measures were standardized. And this is a huge deal, because without standardized weights and measures, you can't have reliable commercial transactions. The Sumerian system of weights was based on units called the shekel and the mina, and the widespread adoption of these standards across Mesopotamia and its trading partners is a testament to the reach and influence of Sumerian commercial culture. When you're trading with partners hundreds of miles away, and you both know that a mina means the same thing in your city as it does in theirs, that's the kind of institutional trust that makes commerce possible at scale. That's not an accident. That's the result of deliberate institution building over many generations. And while we're on the subject of measurement and mathematics, let's give the Sumerians their due for their extraordinary contributions to mathematical knowledge. The Sumerian numerical system was based on the number 60, what we call a sexagesimal system. And while that might seem arbitrary to us today, it actually has some really practical advantages. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That makes it extremely useful for calculations involving fractions, which come up constantly in commerce, construction, and astronomy. And here's the wild part. We are still using the Sumerian-based 60 system today. Every time you look at a clock and see 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour, you are using a system of time measurement that traces its roots directly back to ancient Mesopotamia. Every time you measure an angle in degrees with 360 degrees in a circle, you are working within a framework that the Sumerians helped establish. How crazy is that? 4,500 years later, and their mathematical fingerprints are all over our daily lives. The Sumerians also developed sophisticated techniques for astronomical observation and record-keeping. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and visible planets with remarkable precision. And this wasn't purely for religious or spiritual purposes, though it was certainly that too. Accurate astronomical knowledge had direct practical applications for agriculture, since the timing of planting and harvest cycles was closely linked to astronomical events. It also had navigational applications for the long-distance merchants who were sailing the Persian Gulf and traveling overland trade routes. Knowing the stars meant knowing where you were and where you were going. And in a world without GPS, that was literally life or death. Now, let's zoom in for a moment on the city of Ur specifically, because by 2500 BC, Ur was one of the most important and prosperous cities in all of Mesopotamia. Situated near the mouth of the Euphrates, close to the Persian Gulf, it occupied a strategic position that made it a natural hub for both river and maritime trade. The city was home to tens of thousands of people and featured a complex urban layout with residential neighborhoods, craft workshops, marketplaces, administrative buildings, and of course the famous ziggurat complex at its center. Archaeological excavations at Ur, most famously carried out by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, revealed an extraordinary picture of urban life in the 3rd millennium BC. The so-called Royal Cemetery of Ur, dating to roughly 2600 to 2400 BC, contained burials of extraordinary richness, elaborate tombs filled with gold and silver jewelry, musical instruments, vessels of precious metal, and objects decorated with lapis lazuli and carnelian that had traveled thousands of miles to end up in this city at the edge of the ancient world. The craftsmanship of these objects is breathtaking. Gold helmets hammered to the shape of a human head, with every strand of hair individually represented. Lyres with bulls' heads made of gold and lapis lazuli, jewelry of such delicacy and refinement that it would not look out of place in a high-end jeweler's window today. These weren't just rich people showing off their wealth, though there was certainly some of that going on. These objects were the products of generations of accumulated craft knowledge, of specialized workshops, of trade networks stretching across the ancient world, and of a society wealthy and organized enough to support all of it. And what made Ur wealthy? Trade, commerce, the constant flow of goods in and out of the city through its harbor on the Euphrates. Merchants departing on voyages down the river and into the Gulf, returning months later with holds full of copper, tin, precious stones, and exotic goods. Caravans arriving overland from the north with silver from Anatolia and timber from the mountains of Lebanon. Local workshops producing the textiles, pottery, and finished metal goods that would be packed up and sent back out into the world. It was a city that ran on commerce and the sophistication of its commercial infrastructure, its temples, its merchants, its record keepers, its legal frameworks, its standardized weights and measures, was what made it all possible. Now here's something I want you to really think about, because I think this is one of the most profound points of this whole story. The Sumerian civilization that we've been talking about, with its wheeled vehicles, its canal networks, its bronze metallurgy, its cuneiform writing, its long-distance trade networks, its institutional credit systems, its standardized weights and measures, its astronomical observations, its mathematical innovations. All of this existed in a world without electricity, without steel, without fossil fuels, without any of the energy sources or materials that we think of as the foundations of modern technology. These people built one of the most complex and sophisticated civilizations in human history, using nothing but human intelligence, human labor, fire, water, clay, reed, and bronze. That's it. And they pulled off things that we still haven't fully figured out how to replicate. Think about the organizational challenge alone. Coordinating the construction of a ziggurat, for example, required mobilizing thousands of workers, managing enormous quantities of materials, planning construction sequences in advance, feeding and housing the workforce, and maintaining quality control over the finished product, all without modern project management software, without modern communication technology, without any of the tools we rely on today to manage complex projects. And yet they did it. They built structures that have survived, at least partially, for over 4,000 years. The Great Ziggurat of Ur still stands today, partially reconstructed, as a testament to the engineering and organizational capabilities of a civilization that had been dead for 2,000 years before Julius Caesar was born. Let that timeline sink in. That's how ancient we're talking. And you know what's funny? Not funny, haha, but funny in that way where you laugh because the alternative is just too much to process, is that for a long time, the Western world didn't even know the Sumerians existed. Seriously. Up until the mid-19th century, when European archaeologists began excavating sites in modern Iraq and deciphering cuneiform tablets, the Sumerians were essentially a lost civilization. They weren't mentioned by name in the Bible. They weren't discussed by Greek or Roman historians. They had simply vanished from the collective memory of humanity, buried under thousands of years of accumulated dirt and desert. And then, Like something out of an adventure movie, archaeologists started digging, and this whole extraordinary world just started emerging from the ground. Tablet by tablet, brick by brick, artifact by artifact, an entire civilization came back to life after millennia of silence. That's the kind of story that makes you realize how much we still don't know. How many other civilizations, how many other innovations, how many other remarkable human achievements are still buried out there, waiting to be found. And doesn't that just fire you up? Doesn't that make you want to grab a shovel and start digging? Because here's the thing about the Sumerians that I think is the most important takeaway from everything we've talked about today. They weren't superhuman. They weren't visited by aliens. They didn't have access to secret knowledge from some mysterious advanced civilization. They were people, human beings just like us, dealing with the challenges of their environment with the tools and knowledge available to them, and using creativity, ingenuity, and hard work to solve problems and build something extraordinary. And they succeeded beyond anything we might have imagined possible for a society of their time. The wheel, the canal, the bronze tool, the clay tablet, the merchant ship, the trade route, the interest-bearing loan, the standardized weight, the astronomical calendar. These weren't gifts handed down from the heavens. They were inventions. Human inventions, developed through trial and error, through observation and experimentation, through the accumulation of knowledge across generations. And every single one of them changed the world in ways that still reverberate through our lives today. So the next time you're stuck in traffic on a road that exists because of wheels, or you're checking your bank account and thinking about interest rates, or you're glancing at a clock and noting the 60 minutes in an hour, or you're reading a document that exists because someone, somewhere, once figured out how to turn spoken language into marks on a surface, take a moment, take a breath, and think about the Sumerians. Think about those brilliant, resourceful, endlessly creative people who lived in the land between two rivers 4,500 years ago and basically handed us the foundations of the world we live in. Because honestly, we owe them one. We owe them a massive one. And the least we can do is remember their story, tell it to anyone who'll listen, and marvel at just how absolutely remarkable the human spirit can be when it puts its mind to something. That's the story of Sumerian technology and trade in the early Bronze Age. And if you're not walking away from this feeling at least a little bit pumped up about being human, then I don't know what to tell you. This stuff is extraordinary, full stop.